Good afternoon. Wilkinson here. Today I'm with my friend Larendee Roos. I met her, about a year and a half ago? 2 years ago, maybe?
Must be over 2 years ago
Yeah,
now.
over 2 years ago. She was the cousin or second cousin? I always get this mixed up.
Second cousin.
Second cousin of Rick, the guy I dated during COVID. So we hit it off and we're friends today. We visited back and forth a couple times, and she has a really interesting story. Many stories, actually, so we'll have to condense some of it. But I think to start, Larendee, would you just give us a brief synopsis of where you've come from and what you're about?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me today, and I really am grateful and honored to be with you. So to condense my story, I was raised in an evangelical minister's home, and from a very young age had a deep connection with my spirituality, not just from a religious perspective, but a deep knowing that there was something within me, that a story that needed to be shared and a story that needed to be told, something bigger than myself. I have had a very circuitous journey, and to condense it into a few sentences,
You can talk a little bit. It's okay.
Yeah, okay.
We don't need it too brief.
Okay.
Tell your story.
Yeah. So I was raised in an evangelical minister's home, and after graduating from high school, I went to a liberal arts university that was affiliated with the church that I belonged to at the time. And it was while I was in the university there that I began to ask questions. And those questions were often met by professors with an unwillingness to really delve too deep. And I imagine that was because of the rigidity of the faith that I belonged to at the time. And then also my peers, whenever I would ask questions, seemed to come from a place of confusion, concern. I remember a prayer circle being gathered around me at one point because they were afraid I was going to apostatize. And of course, the more this happened, the more I questioned. And in retrospect, I think I was questioning my whole life. You know a story of our mutual friend, Rick. And I remember sitting across the church from him one time and observing his family and observing who he was in that family system. And the thought occurred to me just kind of out of nowhere. I wonder when the time will come when Rick will really understand and acknowledge who he is as a human being and as a person outside of a more rigid system. And that's just one example.
So his family was in the same church as yours?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So we were raised in the same denomination, and I was in high school by this time, and Rick's quite a little bit younger than I am. So I was of a maturity level that I could look at him as much younger person. So that's just one example of me looking at others, but then also looking at myself in the mirror, asking that question. So I also spent 26 years in the Mormon faith. I left the evangelical faith and really was not attached to any specific denomination when I met my first husband. And we married, and it wasn't until we decided to have children that he announced that he was going to return to Mormonism, and that if we were going to have children, they must be raised in that faith. So I studied. I didn't agree with everything, but there was enough truth that I could hold on to. And while I was in the Mormon church for 26 years, I have to say I had really good experiences, and I kind of took what I agreed with and then just set the rest on a mental shelf. Mm-hmm. After leaving the Mormon church, the reason I left was, again, my spiritual inquiry and my curiosity led me to a point where I eventually found 12 Steps. We're a recovery family. That's part of our story. So April 1, 2008, the world became a safer place because I found myself in an Al-Anon room, which is the support group for friends or family members who have someone with a substance use disorder. Mm-hmm. And on that day, the world became a safer place because I was no longer trying to control people, circumstances, and outcomes. So then through that journey, I was led to a dear friend by the name of Dave Brisbane, who is a minister who helped me understand a Jesus, who is someone that I've always been very close to, from a non-Western mindset and from a more Eastern or Aramaic mindset, which again opened up more possibility and more curiosity, which ultimately led me to A Course in Miracles, of which I've been a student for the last 10 years and am now a minister using Course in Miracles as my foundation for that, which brings us here today.
And here we are.
Here we are.
You know, you gave me a rough draft of a manuscript that you wrote for a book that you'll probably publish someday, I hope.
It's hopeful.
A couple things struck me in there. You say early on that I asked my father a question that had been troubling me. What if we belong to the wrong church? As I prayed that morning, I heard my father clearly again. I don't know if there is a right church, but if you find one that is teaching more truth than what you currently have, then you better join it. So at this point, when you're writing it, you're thinking back on the conversation with your father, correct?
Yeah, right.
Okay, so then was he around when you joined the Mormon church?
He was, and he's still alive.
Okay, and how did he feel about that?
So it's interesting. My father really, even though he's an evangelical minister, and many find the evangelical movement to be very kind of right-wing, my father always came from a more grace-based place, and that we really do come from God, who is a God of love and acceptance, and he really acknowledged and honored my curiosity, and his belief was that if that's where I was led, then there was work for me to do there, and there was things for me to learn while I was there.
So you'd learned something.
My mother, on the other hand, was a completely different story. To this day, it's still, even though I'm no longer in the Mormon church, it certainly was a challenge for her, for sure.
And is she still around, or is she passed on?
She is still alive today, yes.
Earlier, and I kind of got my notes backwards here, but earlier you had written, in my isolated bubble, I thought our little church members were the only ones who understood God.
Growing up, right.
So that's what you grew up with, right? Okay,
right. I always wondered what everyone else did while we were in church on Sunday morning.
Right.
It never occurred to me that they might have their own rituals of observance.
Do you think your father had any inkling that you would go exploring?
Oh, I think
your
so.
Little bubble?
I think so. I was 8 years old when I asked that question, and I was 10 years old when I came across a Book of Mormon and asked him if he'd ever read it and if I could read it. So I think he knew that I was not going to stay too narrow in that path, for sure.
He wasn't real crazy about you reading it, though.
He told me that at 10 years old, it probably wasn't going to be a good idea. That's true.
Oh, okay.
But I will say this, just to give you a perspective of who he is, because I think certainly I say that I am who I am because of my parents and my family of origin, and I've had to do a lot of work because of my family of origin, which I think is pretty true of many of us. And I would say that my father, just who he is very warm and accepting and embracing of many, and always values the person far beyond the ritual or the regimen. So I would say that the journey that I took was probably pre-designed by me. So I think my parents have come to accept. And I think, it's interesting. I've spent a lot of time in the rooms of recovery, and there's always a common theme that I didn't feel like I belonged, didn't feel comfortable in my own skin. And that was my story from as long as I can remember too. Just wondering, how did I get here? There's a whole story, around that too, probably for another podcast, but.
Really?
Yes.
Something, I think probably the thing that popped out and hit me the most, because you're talking, tell a little about your family structure, because it's really interesting. I mean, you've had tons of kids in your life, and
right.
So let's address that a little bit.
Sure. My son says that we don't have a family tree, we have a family bush, and that's probably true. Another kind of interesting thing, from the time I can remember, I wanted to be a mom, and I wanted to have 12 children. I don't know where this came from. It was just an idea I had, and I didn't reach 12 unless you count the dogs that we adopted. But I did reach 10. So The way it works is at the age of 23, I married young, and my first husband had 3 children that we very effectively co-parented with his first wife. And so I helped raise those children. And those are they're my kids. There's always said there's no steps in this house except the ones that lead up to the front door. And then he and I have 3 children together. And then my brother had 2 children with a woman, and then she had a daughter with another man. And from the time the oldest, Seth, was about a year old, they were in and out of the foster care system until Seth was 14. So sometimes we knew where they were, sometimes we didn't. And ultimately, I ended up adopting the middle boy, Shawnee, and his sister, Sabrina, his half-sister, and my current husband, Mark. My first husband and I divorced in 2001, and then my current husband and I married in 2003 and adopted those 2 children. And then he has 2 children. So in total, that's 10. And I often tell people it's not that impressive because we only ever had 7 under one roof at the same time, but it certainly makes for...
Well, seven's pretty impressive. we had 3, and that was funny.
Yes.
So 7 to 7 is a lot. In reading your transcript, it seems like addiction was kind of a theme running in and out of the whole thing, right? Something that you were talking about, I'll read the sentence. You said, my own addiction of attracting and saving the wounded was in full play. And I was either pitied or applauded for holding it all together. How would you describe that? So you're saying that's an addiction, what you were doing. Talk about it.
I've done more work. And I've taken a lot of coursework in the recovery model and case management and intervention and so forth. And what I've come to discover is that, generally speaking, addiction, mental health concerns run in family lines. And I really have never met anyone yet who didn't have some of that thread running through it.
So everyone has an addiction of some sort?
I really believe that we're all recovering from something.
Okay.
And so I grew up in a teetotaler's home. There was never a drop of alcohol in our home. I had no real exposure, although in retrospect, I had an aunt and a couple of uncles who were alcoholics. So now in retrospect, I can recognize the reason I was raised in a teetotaler's home is my father's mother died of alcoholism. And my mother's brothers were alcoholics, and she suffered a lot of abuse at their hands. So and their way of coping was just don't ever have the substance and everything goes away. But what we know happens is being raised by 2 adult children of alcoholics, or where alcoholism is present, and also mental health, sets us up for a lot of codependency. Because my mother, through her own journey, was a very angry person, understandably so. So when you're raised with that, you're always, I took on the role of the peacemaker, making sure everyone's taken care of. And also my mother was very sick when my younger sister and my younger brother were born. So I remember going to kindergarten and having stomach aches. And the reason I was so sick to my stomach was who's going to be at home caring for mom and the 2 young children. This was a pattern that I learned pretty early in life. So it was no surprise that in both of my marriages, addiction was a concern, was an issue.
I don't have the quote, but it seems like I read somewhere where you said that you drew, the way you did it was you feel like you drew those people with addictions into your life so that you could, is that correct?
Absolutely.
And how does that work in your view?
Well, I believe that, first of all, I believe that we make agreements before we come here, and we make contracts with individuals and with our families. So it's no mistake that I was born into the family that I was born into. If you believe in past lives at all, I have many stories, which is room for a whole nother podcast, about people who are in especially my family, and including my current husband, where we had made agreements prior to this life and this existence to come and do some work together.
And you remember that?
And I remember those.
Have you always remembered it, or is it something that's revealing itself to you now?
It's something, let me go back. When I was 4 years old, we were at a friend's home. And I remember waking up from a nap, and I remember what I was wearing. I remember the sofa and that I was sitting on, and crying out because I felt homesick and I wanted to go home. And my father came and picked me up to comfort me. I told him I just want to go home, and him telling me, we'll go home. And he took me home that night, tucked me in bed, and said, see, we're home. And in that moment, I can remember the despair. No one's going to be able to help me make it home. This is not home. This is not where I belong. It literally took me until about 5 years ago to come to peace with my acceptance that I chose to come and learn the lessons and the blessings, but this isn't my ultimate home. It's not my destination.
So you're still waiting to go home.
So it's an interesting journey, because now with the work that I've done, I can feel home, because what I have understood is that it's a state of being, not a place, right? But that's something I've only really come to fully understand in the last 5 or 6 years. So it would make sense with that homesickness, that looking outside of myself, and also because I'm pretty empathic and nurturing by nature, that I would want to be gathering these people unto me. And also the tricky part of it is that when I can be very outward focused and helping everybody else with their journey, there's no time for me to do my work. And so I'm now
Are you subconsciously planning that?
Well, I think that it was subconscious, but also, if I'm really honest with myself, it was pretty intentional. And what I love now, where I'm at, not that I've arrived, but I'm beginning to do this journey, I really enjoy spending time with myself. And I really enjoy going inward and looking at what I think, what I feel, because I'm no longer afraid of that.
Okay, back to what I started to say a few minutes ago. So the part that hit me, you were talking about one of your last conversations with Sean, and before he passed away. Well, I'll just read what it says. As I turned to walk across the game room and started to ascend the stairs, he called out to me, Madre, live your life so mine matters. Wow. I feel it even now. Wow. What did that mean? And have you done it?
So that actually happened after he passed away.
Oh, it was? It was something
It was
that
after
came to you?
he passed away on August 1, 2008. And he, you can imagine the despair. I didn't sleep for a long time. He passed away on a Friday morning. I believe that was a Tuesday evening, and I finally was able to lie down out of pure exhaustion. And as I was coming out of that sleep, I believe I was actually transported. We were in Hawaii at the time. I believe I was transported back to our home in his bedroom, which was something very sacred for him, because having grown up in the foster care system,
He had his place.
he had his place. He finally had his home, right?
Right.
So I went into the room, and you can imagine as a mother, the joy. And I just remember holding him and hugging him and saying, you're still here. You're still here. And him saying, of course, Madre, what are you thinking? Of course I'm here. And then that's when I walked across the game room to walk upstairs, and he said that. So I didn't even know what that meant for the longest time. I remembered it, but I didn't know what it meant. And it was about 5 years later. First of all, it took me 5 years to even be able to talk about his passing without it taking my breath away. And about 5 years later, I was in Las Vegas for a conference, and someone had reached out to me to ask if they could spend some time with me. And I did. And as I was leaving that experience, I had my daughter Brianna with me, and Brianna stopped and she said, Mom, I think I know what Sean meant. I think he wants us to live our lives in a way that honors him and honors us. He wants us to live our lives so that matters. So we went with that. And then it wasn't until I started doing my substance use disorder intervention work that it really occurred to me that what Sean wants me to understand now is to live my life so his will matter. So stop trying to control people's circumstances and outcomes. If it so happens that you're really privileged to sit across from Wilkinson today, that's amazing. And we'll learn together, we'll grow together, we'll love together. But it's not my job to fix or teach. So that's what that means to me today. Do my work.
Do your work.
Do my work.
Which brings up, you have a book in front of you. What is that?
This is my Course in Miracles book. And what I've learned to do, I have a really dear friend. His name is Ben, and I think he wouldn't mind me sharing this story. And we're grateful to be in recovery as well together. It's a story we share. And he said, Larendee, I don't have to be in every recovery room that I've ever been in every day, but I need to be in a room because I never know when someone's going to say something that will pierce through my pain and meet me where I'm at. Right. So that's my story too, that I personally, because my disease of trying to control is really fierce, that I need to do something every day to help me remember the truth of who I am, stay grounded in who I am, so that I can remember my magnitude and my power. So I have a Course in Miracles book in front of me today. And as you were preparing for this, I turned and read, it's from lesson 132 in the workbook for Course in Miracles. And it says, the present now remains the only time. So even as we were preparing to speak today, it really helped to center me, to say, right now, I just need to be present. And I'm really honored to be present with him. And then the other thing is, there is no world apart from the world that I wish. Whatever I desire, the world that I would seek, there's no world outside of that. Now, then the question is, well, how do I know what I really want? That was something that plagued me for some time.
Right.
And again, I'm not saying I've figured this out. I'll just tell you where I am today. And that is, my will and God's will are aligned. My higher powers will are aligned, because just like the greatest desire I have for my children, you have children, right, is their peace and happiness. And I believe that God wants that for me as well. And when I can remember that that's the goal that I would seek, that peace and happiness, again, isn't going to be found outside of me. It's going to be found within me. And I put a quote on my Facebook. It was actually a repost, that sometimes God calms the storm and sometimes he calms the child who can face the storm. The good news is there's no bad news. And the best I can do for myself is study. And I do every day. Now, I'm really fortunate because this is my life's work. So it's kind of a requirement for me that, as I meet with people, whether it's a business person who needs help in a relationship or their own self-discovery, or they need help with their business, I get to do this work every day. At the same time, it's a choice that I've made for me to be at peace. It's the only way that I've been able to figure out. So I use 12 steps. I use Course in Miracles, listen to Esther Hicks, wherever truth can come from. I just try to be a sponge, absorb, and then live it.
So on the Course in Miracles, how'd you get into that? Because I was briefly in a group where we tried to do it, and it was like overwhelming for me.
Sure.
It's like, what?
Sure.
So how do you get past the hump on that?
Sure. Well, in recovery, we say that when the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of change, we'll step into it. I will say that my friend Ben that I was speaking about, he actually tried to introduce me to Course in Miracles back in, I believe it was 1989 or something, maybe early 90s. And I couldn't hear it. I don't even remember it. But years later, he was going through something. And I said, Ben, have you ever heard of A Course in Miracles? And he was dumbfounded. He says, yes, I tried to introduce you to it, but you were so stuck in your, biblical theology, you couldn't hear me.
Right.
But what happened was that through our recovery journey, I met a very dear friend who since has graduated. She's no longer with us. And she would go to her AA meetings. I would go to my Al-Anon meetings on Thursdays at the community church in town. And then afterward, we would go to Marie Callender's and have a bowl of soup or something. It was just lovely. And I remember her saying to me, have you ever heard of A Course in Miracles? And I said I hadn't because I didn't remember. And she said, you talk just like A Course in Miracles. So, but again, I set it on the shelf. Admittedly, though, our family was in a lot of pain, so there could be plenty of reasons why. But it was 2012, so roll the clock forward 4 years now, and I'm walking through a book exchange of one of my clients. He had in his reception area book exchange, and our family was going through a lot. It's kind of been, I guess, our journey a bit. And I looked, and there was a cellophane wrapped 3 books. I looked down on it, and it said A Course in Miracles text, A Course in Miracles workbook, and a manual for teachers. And at that
So
point,
it was new? No, it hadn't been opened up
it had
yet.
never been opened.
Oh.
And I just said, Uncle. I took him home, and I started reading the text, and it was like finally someone was speaking to me in a language I understood. And as you know, if you've read A Course in Miracles, it's written in iambic pentameter, so Shakespearean English, so it's not so easy to read. But there was something that connected with me, and I couldn't put it down. And quite frankly, I would find myself just sobbing in relief that there was finally something that could help me connect with myself so that I could find my way home, right? Which was my pursuit.
I'm going to take a right or left turn. I don't know which one it is, but there's something else I want to talk about, and then I'm going to come back to some of this. But we're going to take almost a timeout. But I want to ask you another question.
Okay.
You're talking about when you were a young girl, and you decided that you were going to do a paper route, and you were up at what, 4 o'clock every morning?
Yes.
7 days a week?
Yes.
Doing this.
Mm-hmm.
This is what you wrote. I also learned to recruit temporary workers and train them to fill in for me if I was on vacation.
Yes.
I made about $40 a month. I had already been bitten by the entrepreneurial bug.
Yes.
So, that was funny. So tell me about some of your entrepreneurial ventures.
What I love about that story is I hired my first mentor too. Her name was Mrs. Carey, and Mrs. Carey taught me everything I knew about how to sell the papers, deliver the papers, including how to fold those papers, right? How to collect on those papers, how to upsell. And so I was 9 years old. And so I was doing the math on that. I've been working for 50 years. And wow. I think in every job that I did, I was always trying to put myself in the place of, if I were the owner, what would I expect?
Yeah.
What would I want, right? It was in 1986 that I went to work for a gentleman by the name of Ken Woolley, who was a serial entrepreneur. He literally had his hands in 10 different things. How did he do that? He was really focused on one thing, hiring the right people that could help him get where he wanted to go to. So
it's funny you say that, because when I was in New York, I worked with Robert Schwartz, and he was a Jewish multimillionaire former Time Life editor who invented the concept of the conference center. He did the first one in the world on that. But that was the thing that one of the things I took away with that time with him is he didn't have to know everything, and he didn't have to micromanage everything.
Right.
He knew when he didn't know something, and he just got the right people to do it.
Right. And Ken would often say that.
Go with it. Yeah.
Right. And Ken would say that. I would ask him a question. He says, I don't know the answer to that, but there's someone who does. Let's go find that person.
Right.
So I think it's why I love, whether I'm doing counseling. I have 2 businesses. I have, 3 businesses actually right now, but I'll talk about 2 of them.
Only 3?
Only 3. Well, and I guess 4 if you count me, because I'm a full-time job. Okay. The Course in Miracles, or the Miracle Activation Center, is a spiritual discovery center from a non-religious, non-legalistic place. So, and then I have Roos Advisors, which is a consultancy firm. So whether we're consulting with executives to help them with their businesses and build their teams, or whether through the Miracle Activation Center, we're helping people discover their own spiritual journey and activate miracles in their own life. It's really, I'm so intrigued, again, so blessed and honored, the people that come to us who are willing to be vulnerable and explore. And there are so many incredible stories. We've worked with over 300 management teams by now in the last 19 years. And
I'm guessing, to interrupt here, but I'm guessing that the universe always sends you the right people at the right time, right?
Absolutely. And when there comes a time that it's time for us to go in a different direction, that also becomes very obvious.
Right.
And there's no fear around it, right? It's just, there's a season and a seasonality of it, and it's beautiful when you can recognize those seasons.
What do you love to do the most?
I love to create a safe place for people to be able to explore and dream big. It's my favorite thing to do, and to help them to see that the answers are within them. I don't have the advice for them. I might have suggestions, but through a series of just holding space, their willingness to put themselves all on the line like that, what really happens is whatever they thought it was going to be usually becomes something so much beyond what they could have comprehended anyway.
You mean the plan they had for some business
Right.
venture or something like that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Or the way it was going to unfold.
Right.
But that's certainly been true with my own business, whether it's Miracle Activation Center or Roos Advisors or our storage development business. What I thought it was going to be, I've kind of thrown away the planning book, quite honestly, because it's a lot of effort. And of course, we do 1, 3, 5-year business plans. I'm not saying
Right.
not to do that, but I'm just saying that I'm not so attached to what I thought it was. There's a line from A Course in Miracles. I release the world from all I thought it was. Gives me so much freedom to just wake up, show up. What's next? What is my higher self telling me to do? When I can stay in that place of creativity.
And I'm assuming that means releasing people too, same way.
Yeah. And that has been tough for me, quite honestly, because I'm a lover of people.
Right.
I love people. My husband often talks about, how do you have so many friends from ages and ages ago? Because I literally love people. So allowing that seasonality, that's actually probably been one of my biggest challenges and my biggest lessons.
Yeah, we're probably going to have to do some more podcasts, I'm guessing. But I want to end with something else. I'm going to read this little paragraph that you had in your transcript, and then we'll talk about that in closing. I had another experience when I was meditating that affirmed my life was transforming again. I dreamed I was standing on a riverbank. There were people in canoes peacefully rowing in a river. I came to understand that the river was peaceful flow. The people in the canoes waved and smiled to come in. I looked up and down the riverbank. There were countless people standing on the banks. Some walked into the river, and a canoe appeared for their transport. Some shook with fear on the side. Those in the river were committed. Somehow I knew it was a big commitment. I waded in, and the next thing I knew, I was in a canoe. I felt immense peace. I knew I would never go back to the riverbank. At the same time, there was no judgment about those on the riverbank. There was a simple invitation to wade into the peaceful river of life. Talk a little about that.
I had forgotten that. I remember the dream. I had forgotten that I included that in that manuscript. For me, it's a way for me to hold that space that we talked about. And it's a way for me to bring grace to myself. I don't need to bring grace to anyone else. Their journey is their journey. Who they are is who they are. And when
They want to live on the riverbank, that's their choice.
They want to live on the riverbank, whatever that is.
Right.
And because I didn't realize that I also had some pretty deep egoic thoughts about pitying people who were on the riverbank. And
probably had a plan for building a bunch of canoes, right?
And I was going to
manufacture these, and
I was going to monetize it. Just ask my children.
Right.
I was going to monetize that too, so there would be plenty of money to build more canoes and save the world. And what I'm understanding, and I shared this a little bit in an email that we exchanged, that I've really had the rich opportunity to discover and explore that the grace I need to give to myself is releasing myself from what I think I have done to others in order to release myself, and that I have no opinions but only love for whoever, wherever, whatever your journey is. Again, I am so honored that every day I get to hear those stories of here's where I'm at, and the whole texture of it, really powerful.
Oh, I love stories. That's why I'm doing this.
And you're really good at it too. You're a great listener, which makes this really good for all of us.
Well, I appreciate you driving down. I'm going to reward you by taking you to dinner in a while.
No.
We'll chat for a while first. If someone wanted to get a hold of you and learn more about you, how would they do that?
They should text my cell phone.
Do you want to really put that out on the podcast?
I absolutely do.
Okay.
I have no fear. 801-209-3611. 801-209-3611.
Very good. Thank you, Larendee. It was great having you.
Thank you. Much love to you.
Okay.